when the sky is high. No reason to stay around. Pick your hands and you can touch and fly.
Hello and welcome to the Aviatrix book review. I'm Liz Booker. My guest today had a 12-year flying career as a corporate and airline pilot. She holds an airline transport pilot certificate and 3 captain qualifications. Her travels took her all over the world in every type of airplane from small single-engine Cessnas to the Boeing 737. She earned her Bachelor of Arts in Journalism and Sociology from New York University and her law degree from American University Washington College of Law. Her first novel, FLYGIRL, the Aviatrix Book Club discussion book for June 2021, is a work of fiction inspired by her own aviation experience. The sequel, Angel Flight, continues the story of the personal and professional challenges faced by female pilots. You can find her at her website, RD Kardon Author, and on social media at RD Kardon. Robin Kardon, welcome.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's an honor to be here.
Well, I'm so excited to talk to you about the book, about your flying experience, and about writing. Before we jump into all that, it would be awesome if you could do a little reading for anyone who might not have had a chance to read FLYGIRL.
I am delighted to do that. And FLYGIRL is about a 30-something female pilot named Tris Miles, who is new to flying. It's a second career for her, and she's trying to advance in her chosen profession. She's all excited about a new job opportunity she has, but I'd like to share with the reader how Tris first became excited about aviation as a child. And this is from FLYGIRL by R.D. Kardon. Grandpa Ed had introduced her to flying. On Sundays, he would come over early and have breakfast with Tris and her parents. Her mother would make blueberry pancakes that had a secret ingredient Tris still didn't know. "Let's go, Princess Patricia. Let's see the miracle of flight," he'd say, as he wiped his mouth and drained his cup of black coffee. She'd jump up from the table, kiss her parents goodbye, and run out to Grandpa's truck. They'd make the 2-hour drive from the tiny town of Pittston to the big city airport. Tris would watch the cornfields roll by as Grandpa's old pickup bounced along with his hands locked in the 10 and 2 position on the steering wheel. When the terminal doors opened, she would run to the plate glass window looking out over the ramp, pressing her nose up against the glass and trying to rub it against the bullseye tip of a 747 parked at the gate. White with a red stripe, the letters TWA painted on the side. "Grandpa, it's so big. How can it fly?" He'd smile down at his only grandchild. "That's the miracle, Princess."
I love it.
Now,
That was totally me sitting at the window in the airport looking at the planes for sure.
well, it's based on an actual experience. Every Sunday, grew up in New York City, and every Sunday, our grandfather would take us to Kennedy Airport. And we would run up and look at all the airplanes. And I do remember seeing a TWA 747 parked at the gate, and it always had the red stripes in the front on the nose. And I was always like, wow, can I touch noses with that airplane? It always just seemed so big to me, and it is big.
Yeah, that's so great.
I want to take you to another brief reading. Now, remember, Tris is trying to advance in her career. And the story of FLYGIRL, which tracks an experience that I had when I was first pursuing the career of being a professional pilot. She's interviewing for a job that she thinks is the job of her dreams. And she gets the job, and she joins a corporate flight department, which has a number of pilots in it, all men, who've been together for a really long time. And the chief pilot of the company assigns a retired naval aviator to train her. So this scene is, she's new at the company. She's doing her first observation flight. She's flying in the jump seat while her training captain and another pilot at the company are doing the flying. They land in Asheville, North Carolina, and they're sitting around waiting for their passenger, which is what corporate pilots do. They land and then they sit around and wait for their passengers to come back so that they can fly home if they're not doing it overnight. So they're sitting in the airplane, and it is Triss, our main character, our heroine, Ed Dieter, her training captain, retired Navy pilot, and Larry Ross, who's another captain at the company. Dieter looked past Ross and sat down opposite Triss. He turned his head to the side momentarily, then swiveled around to face her directly. So, how exactly did you get this job? Ross's head shot straight up, then bobbled like one of those dolls in the rear windshield of her car. I submitted a resume, I interviewed. Caught off guard, her response sounded sarcastic, but that's exactly how it happened. Yeah, we heard about that interview. Ross stared at Dieter like the older man had lost his mind, but it didn't stop him. We weren't invited, were we, Larry? Dieter turned to Ross, who looked as if speaking would cause him physical pain, his expression a mix of shock and fear. Oh, come on, Larry, Dieter continued. You know that one day they just told us they'd hired her and when she was starting. They promised we'd get a chance to meet all potential new hires, and then she just shows up. He paused to sip his coffee. Nothing personal, of course, he said. Ross searched maniacally for something in his briefcase. Dieter's glare never left Triss. She looked right back at him and said, I really wanted to meet you guys too. I was sure I'd enjoy flying with you. I'll bet. Dieter's exasperation was palpable. You know, we had a lot of guys who wanted this job, guys with military experience, jet experience, years and years of flying crap for substandard outfits, waiting for a chance like this. He paused for effect, then spat, and they chose you. I wanted to see the country. I wanted to travel the world. I wanted to fly international, not just pull up at the gate in Cleveland and head back to Exeter. I wanted to see things. She held out two open palms. And I wanted to fly there myself. I wanted to pull up on the ramp in the cockpit in Beijing and London and Moscow as captain of this airplane. Captain? Dieter's face burned red. Are you fucking kidding me? You're talking about being a captain? You just got here, lady, and if you think, Ed, shut up, will you? Ross said. Look, Triss, look, I think Ed just wants to know why you took the job. I mean, you had a pretty good airline gig, right? They were all quiet. Seconds passed like hours. I can't think of a better life, Triss said at last. Neither can I. I earned this life fighting for my country. Dieter lifted his cup and drank his coffee, but she could hear the echo of the unasked question. What did you do? And this is the reception she receives at her new job. And the story, of course, continues from there. How does she manage to succeed in the job? If she does, what are the dynamics between her and the other pilots in the department? And what does it mean for her career ultimately?
Well, so let's get into that. Let's start with you and your inspiration for flying. You talked about your grandpa going to the airport with you, but you had a career before you started flying. Tell us about that.
I was an attorney. I graduated from law school and then immediately began practicing, and I practiced for 10 years. I was a commercial litigator. And it was actually litigation that brought me back to flying, which was something I'd always wanted to do since I was a child. I was talking with one of my clients at the law firm where I was practicing, and I asked him what he did in his spare time, and he said he was a private pilot. And I said, well, I've always wanted to fly. And he said, well, call my son. He's a flight instructor. And I did. And after my second lesson, I was convinced that I was going to make aviation my second career.
Wow, that's amazing. And so you jumped right in. And then, as we know from what you just read in the book, not everything was maybe as you expected it to be or hoped it would be, was it?
It was challenging. It was very challenging. I had to work full time to get my ratings, and I could only actually fly on the weekends. So it took me a good long time, a little bit longer than most people, to get my certified flight instructor ratings. And as soon as I did, I quit my legal job, and which was a fairly affluent position and began working as a flight instructor, which back then paid $10 an hour.
Wow. Yeah, that seems to be a common theme for a lot of women that I've talked to. I'm sure the men too, but I just haven't had the opportunity to talk to as many men through this project of having to work full time to pay for your flight hours. And then, yeah, the flight instruction stuff seems like hard work. How long did you do that? How long were you a CFI?
Was a flight instructor from 1992 until I joined my very first regional airline, Lone Star Airlines, in 1994. And I had about 1,000 hours of dual instruction given.
Okay. You fast forward to now and you've written a book about your experiences. Why did you write this book?
The book actually started back when I was having the experience, when I did integrate an all-male corporate flight department in the early 90s. And the reception was, shall we say, quite cool. And no one was really that interested, I think, in having an outsider join the company. They certainly weren't interested in an outsider that they perceived as less experienced than they were. And they definitely weren't interested in someone that they felt was less deserving. This was back in the time when the airlines were under affirmative action orders for failing to treat women fairly during the interview process. And I was not going to be accepted from the beginning. They didn't know me. And then when I joined, I was so happy to be there, and I was bubbly and I was outgoing. And of course, because I was there, I believed I deserved to be there. And that probably, probably made them the most angry, was that I expected to be treated like everyone else. And they did not feel that they needed to do that. So it was a really difficult work environment. It was a very hostile work environment. And in order to manage it, I did what I've always done throughout my life, is express myself in writing. I kept a daily journal of things that actually happened, and I wanted to make sense of the situation. So I actually fictionalized it. And I started writing what ultimately became FLYGIRL, while the events that it's based on were happening to me. And I created characters, all of which still have the names that I created in the early 90s, with the possible exception of Tris Miles. She had a different name back then, but all of the other characters have the same names that I picked back then. And I remember I got to 83 pages, which I wrote in a word processing program called WordPerfect, which barely exists anymore. And I printed it out on a dot matrix printer on old blue note paper and stuck it in a manila folder. And on the tab, I wrote book. And I carried that folder with me every time I moved. When I moved, this was all happening when I lived in Chicago. When I moved from Chicago to San Diego many years later, still had the folder that said book. And because I hesitate to leave any project unfinished, no matter how long it takes me, in 2015, I made a concerted effort to finish writing the book, and I did.
Wow, so that's interesting. So for anyone who hasn't been a participant in the Aviatrix Writers Group, Robin has been generous enough to give us a workshop on the decision to write fiction or to write memoir. And so I knew where you stood on that issue and, why you chose to craft this particular book in fiction. But I was surprised to just hear you say that it started out that way. What at that point was what made you want it to be written as fiction then?
There were a few things. One was very simple. As a child, I had always written, and I always wanted to be, I wanted to win the Nobel Prize in fiction. So I always thought I would be a novelist. I think the Nobel Prize has more than likely eluded me, and that's okay. But I always had it in my mind that I would write a really interesting novel. But later when I was exploring what type of format I would use, and we have talked about this extensively before, Liz, I did battle with whether I wanted to tell the exact story and whether I wanted to fictionalize it. And I elected to fictionalize it for a number of reasons. The first was I wanted to give readers an authentic peek at what it really was like to be a woman in aviation at that time. And to do so, I wanted to draw on the experiences not only that I had, but that other women I knew at the time had, and incorporate them in the book. The set of facts on which FLYGIRL is based, and you'll see on the inside flap of the hardcover says inspired by actual events, and it was. I also wanted to change the ending. You know, it was such a terrible experience for me, and it ended quite badly. And I thought, there has to be a hopeful message in this. There has to be some way to turn this around, to be able to make the point that even if you're in a bad situation, that doesn't mean your career is over. Because I remember thinking at the end of this job experience, I remember thinking, this is it. My flying career is probably over. And it wasn't. It wasn't. And so I had to tell more than just the story. So that's another reason I elected to fictionalize it. There is always the possibility that I will write a memoir in the future. But this choice of format was extremely well received. It's been well received by readers, and the publishing industry has received it extremely well. So I thought, all right, maybe that was the right choice after all.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. Are you comfortable talking about where it departs from fact and what parts are true?
Oh, I'm perfectly comfortable talking about it. So, for example, there's a really important scene about
Oh, and
2/3 of
then
the way through
I
the
just
book.
want to give a warning, though, that we are getting now into spoiler alert territory for anyone who hasn't read the book. So, okay, keep going.
And I'm going to keep it very vague to limit the possibility of spoilers.
Okay, so perfect.
But
Okay.
thank you for that alert, Liz. You're exactly right. There's a very important flight scene where Tris and Dieter are in the cockpit during a very tense situation, and Dieter lets fly an insulting slur that is something that would be considered inappropriate under any circumstances. And what does Tris do with that? What does she, how does she handle that? That actually did happen to me, but not at the job, not at that job. I took that and I thought, this is a really great way to quickly show the audience how men sometimes speak in the cockpit in a very disrespectful way towards women when something stressful is going on. So I took that from another experience that I had at a different job, and I added that. And of course, the major way that the book departs from real life is the way it ends. And so as not to spoil it, I gave it a very positive ending, not like, fireworks and exploding balloons of happiness, but a positive, strong ending for our main character, where in actual fact, the way the employment relationship actually ended was I was fired from the job. And I was left, with having a termination on my record. And the reason was because I had raised the issue of unfair treatment to management, and they lost their minds. Instead of looking into the issue, they just assumed that the only way they could handle it was to get rid of me. So they did.
So, I have a question for you. I know you've been out of the industry for a few years, but what advice would you give to a woman who encounters something like that in her career, based on your experience and maybe based on the climate that as you know it now?
I believe that companies are significantly more sensitive now to handling female professionals, and how a way of being so that everyone is treated with dignity and respect. So I think that, and this was a Fortune 100 company I was flying for, I think that if a woman went to her supervisor and said, this is a situation that I'm extremely uncomfortable with. Can you help me? Can you give me, some ideas on how to handle it? I think she'd get a better response than I did. I have to believe that. in situations, and to be frank, if a woman or anyone, not just a woman, was feeling marginalized, or harassed, or that they were in a hostile work environment for whatever reason, and they did not feel that their manager would be their advocate, honestly, I would suggest they get out of the environment as soon as possible and go to a more supportive environment. There is no reason. I wish I could tell you how many times I received advice from people who would say, just leave, just quit. And my response would be, you know what? I like this job. I want this job. This is the job I want. I want to do everything I can to try and make it right, but there really was no way. And I was a lot younger, and I wasn't, I don't think, emotionally mature enough to understand that. And had I understood it, I probably would have just said, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm going to be on my way and I'm going to go do something else. There is no shame in that, none whatsoever, to walk away from a bad situation. I wished I'd have done it. And I have, in my work counseling job applicants, I have counseled many, many people to do it.
Okay. So some of these people who created the hostile environment, well, we had what seemed to be like an ally in Ross, and then we obviously had our antagonist, Dieter, and a few others for sure. Tell me about the decisions for those characters, how you kind of rolled up maybe your experiences with other pilots into single characters to create those guys.
Uh, they are both very, very closely modeled on real people. To the point where if the real people were to read the book, they would surely recognize themselves in those characters. There is no doubt in my mind. I used a technique called the opponent ally, which is a writing technique I learned as I was taking writing courses in actually how to craft a novel. And the opponent ally is, you take a character and they may start as someone who's an antagonist, or they may start as someone who's an ally. And by the end of the book, they flip. So Dieter, who is the most antagonistic of antagonists, at the end of the book ends up doing something that is extremely helpful to Triss. And the reason, in real life, that did not happen, but I wanted to write him that way because I was writing someone with a history of being a military pilot. And I have nothing but respect for people who have served their country in the military. And I didn't want to leave the book with a bad taste toward military pilots. So I flipped him from an opponent to ally. Larry Ross starts off as someone who Triss thinks is going to be her ally, but he has problems of his own and ends up, joining in a very unholy alliance with another leader of the flight department in order to see that Triss can't harm them. And I'll leave it at that. They have some perceptions about her, whether they're true or not. Those are their perceptions. And that's another issue I think the book highlights, is how we can perceive things about people, how we can imbue them with thoughts and beliefs that they may or may not have. And we never ask the question, what do you think? How easy it would be to just walk up to somebody and say, what do you think about this? What is your perspective on this? Now, fear prevents us from doing that a lot of the time in our personal and professional lives. So it's a courageous act. Sometimes it's a courageous act to ask someone a question when you may not like the answer. But in this particular case, these characters made a decision. They created a whole story, which may or may not have been true, which led them to action. And Ross, at the end of the book, becomes an opponent.
I love that. I love the point that you just made. If we spent more time, trying to understand each other's perspectives, maybe we could come closer to the middle when we're having those difficult conflicts. So, and then sometimes people are never going to budge too. So there's always that.
Oh, that's the truth. I remember my mom. This was back, gosh, so long ago. My mom was alive, and I remember asking her, what do I do about this guy, Dieter, whose name, of course, is not Dieter? And she said, what, Robin? She said, some conflicts are just not worth it. Some challenges are just not worth it. There are some you're never going to win.
Yeah, that's
And
unfortunate.
I think she had a really good point, and I think that was
Yeah.
a very relevant piece of advice at the time.
Yeah. What else do you want to talk about Fly Girl that we haven't yet? Is there anything else?
Other than the fact that I'm extremely proud of it, other than the fact that it took 25 years from the first time I created these characters until it was published, and I say that as a message of hope to people who maybe have not, even started their writing careers. If they're interested in doing that, it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't have to happen overnight. Writing is one of the things you can do forever. We all know airline pilots have to retire at 65, but you can write literally until your final days. So it doesn't matter when you start, just that you start.
That is super inspiring. Thank you. Even for me, it's inspiring. Well, so Trish lives on in your second novel, Angel Flight. What do you want to tell us about Angel Flight?
A few things. When you sit down to write a second book, to me, the most important characteristic of the second book is it has to be better than the first. In other words, to me, if I had learned anything from writing FLYGIRL and the feedback from FLYGIRL, I wanted to make sure I incorporated it to write an even better written, more engaging book. And reviews seem to indicate that I did do that, and I'm incredibly proud of that. It does continue. Angel Flight does continue the story of Tris Miles, but it in the sense that it's a sequel, it is also a standalone. It does continue her story, but you could read them out of order. You could read one and not the other, and you really wouldn't be missing anything. It really is a different story. We start with Tris at the next stage of her life, a year or so after the experience that she has in FLYGIRL, where she's with a different company, where she's valued, appreciated. She's up for promotion to chief pilot. And, she's in a very comfortable place career-wise. So now she's trying to get her personal life on track. And she ends up in a relationship with another local pilot, which is also very typical in the industry because the crazy hours and schedules, who else do you meet? And ends up having to compete with her romantic interest for the coveted promotion. And it all takes place against the backdrop of the company being asked to fly its very first angel flight, which in the commercial aviation side of the house is essentially an emergency medical flight, where a company may donate an airplane and its crew, which is a great expense, to fly someone in a remote area to a place where they can get specialized medical treatment. And that is the background story of Angel Flight.
That's awesome. And I hear you're working on the third book. How's that going?
Mm-hmm. There will be a third book and we'll call it a trilogy because it will involve, again, Tris Miles will be the main character. And it's at a later stage in her career. The book doesn't have an actual title yet. It has maybe 30 or 40 working titles. We can't really pinpoint it yet and I don't feel comfortable choosing a title until I'm a little bit further down the road with writing it. It's currently in its second draft. It is being professionally edited. So I'm in editing stages. And at each stage, I'll receive feedback from my editors. And I will try and execute their suggestions. So a book is made up, and of two different streams of work. One is putting together the plot as you wish it to be, and then executing those plot points, actually writing the book. The creative process of describing, in a way that touches the reader, the plot point that you've decided on. So I'm in that stage now. I expect that the editing phase will go on for another 4 to 6 months at least, at which point, the book will have reached a stage where it could be published.
Okay. Would you like to do a little reading of Angel Flight before we wrap up?
Yes, I would.
That'd be great.
As I've mentioned, Angel Flight takes Tris to the next place in her career. And the passage I'm going to read is, she is a captain now at a charter company based at the same airport where FLYGIRL is based. And she's flying with a co-pilot that she's trying to get upgraded to captain. They are flying into one of my favorite airports on the planet, Jackson Hole, Wyoming. You know, any person who has flown in there either commercially as a pilot or as a passenger knows that crossing over the Teton Range into the valley that is Jackson, Wyoming is one of the most spectacular sights you can imagine. And we pick up with Tris and her co-pilot Bruce. They've just landed at Jackson and they're getting ready for their overnight. The company has booked them at a 5-star resort in Jackson Hole, and they're all excited about that overnight. And here's the reception that Tris gets from one of the rampers, which is going to be followed by a little insight into her personal life. So here we go from Angel Flight by Robin Kardon. Tris busied herself brushing crumbs off the seats and collecting trash. She crossed the seat belts, made sure all the seats were forward and tray tables stowed. The rug needed a quick vacuum. Tris grabbed the full bag of trash and went to request a shop vac. She ran into the bearded ramper she hadn't recognized before. She smiled and held out her hand. Hey, we haven't met. Tris Miles. I remember you. He touched her hand quickly and turned away. Wait, what? You do? Have we met? Yep. You came in here a couple of times in an Astral. He laughed and jabbed his thumb toward her airplane. That little prop you ride now? Ah. She was used to being looked down upon by other pilots who flew bigger, more sophisticated aircraft, but a ramper? As he turned away again, she called after him, I need a vacuum and a lav service. He kept walking. Now, he smirked. You sure that's what the captain wants? Despite the cold, Tris hadn't yet put on her parka, so she rotated the sleeve of her uniform jacket so he could see her epaulets. I am sure, she said evenly. Yes, Captain, he said as he walked off to comply with her request. Tris didn't know whether the deep-seated respect for her authority drove his rude behavior or if he was just a jerk. Thanks to what she'd learned in therapy, all Tris needed to shake off the encounter was to breathe deep and look around. From the top of the Royals air stairs, Tris could make out busy ski runs, lifts going up and down the mountains, skiers in bright colored clothes and hats shifting their weight back and forth as they flew down the slopes. No way that guy was going to disrupt her enjoyment of this wintry paradise. So that's Tris landing on the ramp in Jackson Hole, and later they check themselves in to the 5-star resort, the Snake River Lodge, which actually exists and where I've stayed many times, and I love it. And this is the very beginning of the next chapter. Now, at a party a few weeks before, Tris meets a pilot named Mike, and sparks fly. A burly taxidermied bear stood at the entrance to the Snake River Lodge, reared up on his hind legs, teeth bared, and looked poised to devour anyone who walked past. Tris was not a fan of the wall-mounted moose heads in the lobby or animal trophies generally, but she loved this bear. Something about his ferocious expression, paws raised and ready to shred an attacker, made her feel somehow shielded from the harsh winter environment. While she waited for Bruce, she reached up and petted its head. It was cold. Tris eventually shoved both hands in their thin leather gloves deep into the pockets of her parka. Impatient to get going, she rocked back and forth on the heels of the red and black cowboy boots she had dusted off for this trip. Her mobile phone rang. She didn't recognize the number on the caller ID, but it might be their passengers with a flight update. While she was technically off duty, she was on the road, and Woody paid for the phone, so she had to answer it. Hello, Tris Miles. Tris? Hey, Tris. This is Mike. You know, from Heather and Bruce's party? His voice had a sexy, scratchy tone, like he'd just woken up. For a second, he sounded like Bron. She held the phone closer to her ear. Oh, hey, how are you? Where are you? Actually, I'm on an overnight in Medford, Oregon, in a Royal. First the location, then the equipment. Typical greeting among pilots. She laughed. Ah, nice. But I think I can do you one better. Oh, yeah? How's that? You in Miami or something? Miami? I'll never figure out people's love affair with that place. No, much, much better. Jackson Hole. A slight whistle accompanied his long exhale. Wow, where are you staying? Snake River Lodge. The one with the big bear? Yep, I'm standing right next to him. Tris leaned against her stiff, furry friend and grabbed one of his extended paws. Tell him hello for me, would you? The proverbial ice broken, Mike paused. At first, Tris thought it was the connection. Mike? Yeah, I'm here. So, Tris, you around this weekend? Like possibly to go out with me to do something? Tris squeezed the stuffed paw. Love to. When? Moments later, after they'd set a date, Tris twirled around the arms of her static furry partner in an improvised Texas two-step.
I love it. Okay, I have some things to say and I have a question for you, even though this isn't a discussion about angel flight, but I want to ask this. So first of all, thank you so much for writing FLYGIRL and for writing Angel Flight and the work that you're doing on the third in the trilogy now. I can't wait to read it too. I already started Angel Flight, so I know a little bit about where we're going with that. I would say in FLYGIRL, I think I've said this to you before, but I really identified with the small group dynamics that you set up in that book. I experienced them myself. And if you have great people, that's a great experience. And if you have difficult people, it's a difficult experience, period. Right. And you certainly set up an accurate, difficult experience for sure that I think anybody who's been in that situation can identify with in a commercial, military, or any other context. So I thought that was great. In Angel Flight, I did note that you had Tris in therapy, and at least then, and I don't know what the rules are now, but at least then, you know, that was not a thing that you wanted your medical officer to know in the military or presumably in the civilian world either. So you must have done that for a reason, and I wondered if you wanted to talk about that particular point about having her in therapy as a pilot.
I wanted to highlight, and this was extremely important to me. So in FLYGIRL, I highlighted discrimination and harassment in the workplace and the hostile work environment. In Angel Flight, there's always an important issue that I'm addressing in my books. As I like to say, I write because I have something to say. And what I had to say in Angel Flight was to highlight the way that medical issues, particularly those affecting female pilots, but affecting all pilots, are handled in the regulatory environment. When this book takes place, which is the late 90s and early 2000s, it was completely taboo to seek therapy, to seek counseling from a therapist. And if you had disclosed it on your FAA first class medical application, there was a very distinct possibility that your application would have been deferred. So any pilot I knew that sought therapy did it on their own dime, never claimed insurance for it, never told anyone, which always seemed a little backwards to me, because it would seem to me, especially when you consider the very well-known Germanwings accident, I think in 2008, 2009, where a severely depressed pilot locked the door to the cockpit and flew his airplane into a mountain. You know, that is the last thing you would want. I had also had experience with thinking, especially after the job experience I had, it was FLYGIRL, you know, that I would love to seek therapy, but that the only people who could get away with it and still keep their medicals were men who claimed they had marital problems. That was the only thing. Right. You had to be a man and you had to say you had a marital problem. If you were a depressed female, or depressed at all, male or female, you know, you ran the risk of having your medical deferred, which basically meant you couldn't work. I also learned through the personal experience of a friend, a woman who was a bit older than me, who was having perimenopausal symptoms when she was flying. And there's a subplot in Angel Flight that deals with that issue. And the fact that she couldn't be upfront about that with her employer, even though it was affecting her behavior and her abilities in the cockpit, and how she ultimately handled that, you know, ended up doing her more harm than good. So that's a storyline in Angel Flight as well. I do know now that the FAA does permit people to fly with antidepressants, certain approved antidepressants. The paperwork you have to do to get that permission is quite extraordinary. And I still, to this day, in various social media groups that I belong to, see discussions among professional pilots that say, if you need to go see a therapist, just don't tell anyone. It's just easier that way. It's
Yep.
just easier.
I'm
that way,
just going to
which is
echo that
incredibly
was,
sad.
yeah, it's terrible. And that was definitely the attitude in the military. The only time I was in a place where I felt like I needed something like that was when I was pregnant. And I've had 3 pregnancies and they've all been different. But my second pregnancy, which I flew till 5.5 months, later in the pregnancy, I started to recognize that I was having a chemical imbalance. And it was chemical for sure. And I was not functioning the way I normally do. My moods were very dark, and I came this close to getting help. And I had a day where I was waiting for a call back for an appointment, and I thought, now this is going to be in my record. I might lose my flight status, even though this is temporary and I'm pregnant. And I deliberately chose to manage myself. When I was having those moments at work, I was out of the cockpit at this point, but I would just close my doors and lock myself in my office and gut it out until I got through it. And then I was fine afterwards. So the only therapy I've had is when I transitioned to retirement from active duty, which was helpful. You know, I was making a lot of huge life changes, and it was exactly what I needed. So it's unfortunate that the culture remains that way, because I do think that it's much better for everyone, for our employers, you know, to keep people on and keep them healthy, and for the pilots and their families, if everybody can get the help they need. Same thing for our military members too. So yeah.
I totally agree. You know, and add to the fact that you know, there's such a stigma around mental illness to begin with, regardless, you know, of who is suffering. And you make a really interesting point. You know, the issues that you suffered were during pregnancy, and that is, by definition, a chemical imbalance. You know, there are huge changes going on, you know, in the body of a pregnant woman. There's nothing you can do. It's not a character flaw, you know, and that attitude that, you know, well, why can't you just put on your big girl pants and buck up? You know, sometimes you can't. And it's not a character flaw. It's not a character flaw. It's just a recognition that everyone is different and we need different things. You know, not being able to, again, buck up. But if you spend 5 sessions with a therapist that has the same result, you know, what's wrong with that? What's the problem with that? And aviation was very, very slow to come around on that issue. And I'm not sure they've fully come around. And and in the 3rd book, there's also, you know, a point, and I'm not going to share that right now, but, you know, there's also a point to the story. And I hope that like in FLYGIRL and Angel Flight, it will entertain readers.
Well, I can't wait to read book 3 as well and find out what important message you have there. And before what we're going to do is we're going to transition into talking a little bit about writing. But before we do that, I just wanted to say thank you so much. You have been involved in the Aviatrix book club basically from the moment it started. And you've been an enthusiastic participant in the book club, and especially supportive of the writers group, which is what we're going to talk about a little bit more for the writers out there. But thank you, Robin, for your book, and thank you for your participation and support for this project.
Well, thank you, Liz, for creating this project. You did the work. And all I can say is, when I saw that you had created the Aviatrix book club, first thought that came to my mind was, why didn't I do that? And the fact is, I didn't. You did. And you deserve all the credit in the world for it. It's a wonderful organization. It was a need. It was a need that was definitely there, that had gone unfulfilled until you created this organization. So thank you.